In the 50 years that I've been doing woodworking, I tell you, I've ruined a lot of wood. Yeah. Some of that was from mistakes I made in cutting. The old, hey boss, I cut it off twice and it's still too short. Yeah, I've been known to do that too. I still do every once in a while. Doesn't matter that the measuring twice doesn't work if you're working with the wrong measurement, But the one I'm concerned about is the wood that gets lost between the lumberyard and the workbench. How we treat our wood when we buy it, from the moment we're looking at it in that lumberyard to the time we start working it, makes a lot of difference. There's a lot of things that can go wrong with that wood if it's not stored properly and if it's not bought properly. So what I want to do today is I want to talk about that process. I want to talk about the things that can go wrong so that hopefully we can avoid them in the future. Let's start out with something that almost doesn't seem like it belongs here, and that's not knowing what you're buying. Now, that seems kind of silly, right? You go to the lumberyard, you want 6 1x4s. You know what 1x4s are. What is there to worry about? Yeah, but what exactly are those 1x4s you're buying? Now, you're probably not going to know what kind of pine they are, although you'll know they're pine. You probably don't know where they came from, although there's a possibility it might have a sticker on it that says product of Finland, and you'll be surprised because, well, why didn't we get it from the United States? I don't know. But the thing I'm really talking about here is, what has the sawmill done? And we may not be able to find out that information. But all wood is either air dried or kiln dried. It's nice to know which it is. But what do they mean when they say air dried? Now, you'd think that would be a pretty common term and everyone would understand it. But some sawmills don't properly stack the wood when they air dry it. You could have a stack that's like this, leave it sitting in a shed somewhere and call it air dried. Well, but if this was wet wood when I stacked it up, that's not really air drying because there's no air circulation. The air can't get between these boards to dry it out. If that sits there a year and then we go and pull it apart, we might find that the wood in the middle is just as wet as it was the day that it was cut in the sawmill. Not only that, not only is it wet, but it may have started to mold, decay, who knows what, because it didn't have a chance to dry out. Now, proper drying, what they call stickering, is putting strips of wood in there that are either 3/4 of an inch or 1 inch square to allow air circulation. And then not only that, but it's stacked up and then it's weighed down. And the whole idea there is to prevent warp. If you get a bunch of wood that's warped, it probably wasn't properly air dried. So that's one of the things that is a concern of ours. Unfortunately, it's something we may not be able to find the answer to. I'll guarantee you can't go into Home Depot and ask them, how did the sawmill air dry this wood? They won't know. And it's probably the same thing in your local lumberyard. But it is something to take into consideration. It is something to look at. And you'll be able to tell a lot by the condition of the wood. The next thing that can really mess up our wood is not checking the wood thoroughly. Now, you'd think this would be a given, but no, we really need to check that wood. And I'm not just talking about Home Depot. There's a lot of jokes that go around about the quality of the wood in Home Depot, but I find the same problems elsewhere. A lot of the wood we look at has been picked over by 50 other people who are trying to find the best boards possible, and the first 20, 30, 50 boards we look at that have been picked over are the ones that they already rejected. Now, for this reason, I won't order wood from Home Depot. And I would order a lot of other things, and I'll do an order online, and then my wife will pick it up on the way home from work. That works out really well for me because Home Depot is about halfway between her work and home, and so it's an easy pickup for her. But I certainly won't do that with lumber. I will go and get the lumber there myself, no matter how inconvenient it is, and whether or not I think I've got the time to do it. Why? Well, because I know that if I order it, then their workers will go and pick up the wood, but they'll pick the stuff that other people have picked over. So I'm going to end up with the worst of the worst, right? Now, I want the best of the best. So when I go in, and I'm sure a lot of other people do this as well, but I'm one of those guys that others will get irritated at, and maybe even the employees, because I'm being really picky as I look over the wood. What am I looking for? Number one thing I'm looking for is warps, okay? Wood warps in all kinds of ways. We can get cupping in that board where it's across the width of the board. We can get bows along the length. We can get a warp this way. But the worst is twisted. Now, I can work with just about anything else, but twisted boards, unless you're building something where it really doesn't matter, or you're cutting into really short pieces, that's a real serious problem. And it's the easiest one to miss because you can check the, hold that board up and look it for warp. Yeah, it looks pretty good, and miss the fact that, oh, wait a minute, I didn't flip it the other way and look to see if there's any twist in it. It can be a little tricky to check for twists, okay? But that's the most important one to check for. And while we're checking for it, we want to check for other things that can be going on there. Pith, okay? If you buy 2x lumber, there's a strong possibility it's going to have some pith in it. And you may have to cut around that pith to get the pieces that you want. Dings, scratches, the board just plain being beaten up. The boards that when we buy dimensional lumber, that's intended for construction. That's not intended for furniture, unless you buy select grade. Okay, and I'm talking about the stuff that has no knot holes in it. Most of what you buy, number 1 and number 2 select aren't going to be really select. They're going to have some knot holes. Like this board right here. This looks like a piece of number 1 select. It's got some little tiny knot holes in it. That's a pretty decent board, but it's not knot hole free. If I want that, I need to go to a premium grade of wood. All right. So what is it that I really need? But because it's intended for construction, and in most cases the wood will be hidden by other things like drywall, they don't worry in the process of manufacturing it and shipping it and stocking it whether it gets scratched or dinged. And those scratches and dings can ruin whatever it is that you're trying to make out of it. So you want to look for those. You also want to look for things like sap. This board's got a sap thing here, and it actually extends through the board and comes out here. I don't know what sort of defect caused that, but that can end up being a problem. It certainly would be a problem for finishing, but it may even be a problem for assembly because the glue isn't going to stick properly. Then you get things that sometimes you don't see, like here's a knot hole here, and that's a nice tight knot hole, but you flip it over to this side, and we've got I don't know what kind of defect there was in that log when they cut that out, but there's a defect there. Those are the types of things that you can run into, so you need to look for those very carefully. And then finally, watch out for the pith. Now the pith is the very center of the log, okay? Now, a lot of dimensional lumber is going to contain or come from close to the pith. Now if you look at this end of this board right here, okay, you can see I've drawn the rings on there. And this actually includes the pith in this 1x4, and that's pretty unusual. A lot of times you'll find the pith in 4x4s, but 1x will usually be a little farther out from the center. No, this one is right on the center. I see pictures all the time online of guys who have done an edge-glued panel for a tabletop or something, and then they post the picture the next day and say, why is it all warped? And I look at the grain pattern on the end, and yeah, they got wood that was too close to the pith, or maybe included the pith, okay? It's bound, it's a cup. And then there's this rumor that goes around, one of those woodworking myths that say, well, the way you solve that is you make sure you get opposite directions. So this one, the curvature is this way. I'm talking about the curvature of the rings, and this way it's this way. And no, that just averages it out. You're still going to end up with waves then. It's not going to solve the problem. So that's something you want to be looking out for. Look at it. Depending on how you're going to use that board, look at it before you buy it. Look for the pith. Look for the curvature of the rings. The next thing that can be a big problem for us is not allowing the wood to acclimate. Now, this is the first thing that really deals with the wood getting into our shop, okay? When it gets to your shop, you certainly don't want to start working it. And I'll have to admit, I've done this many a time. I'll buy the wood, I'll take it home, and I'll start working on the project because that morning when I woke up, I had no plans on making that project, or I thought of it as soon as I got up, and I didn't have the lumber to do it. So I go to the lumber yard, buy the lumber, bring it home, and I start cutting it up, and I haven't allowed it to acclimate. What do I mean by acclimating? I mean let it sit in the workshop, and the environment it's going to be cut up and assembled in, okay? Why? Because of temperature and moisture. Now we all know that moisture affects wood, right? Wood is a porous product, and it'll absorb moisture and it'll release moisture. And there's even seasonal variations on that, where some seasons of the year there's more of that than others. Now it's not as big an issue as it was, say, 100 years ago, because all of us have heated and air-conditioned homes. But if your workshop isn't air-conditioned or your workshop isn't heated, then that can be a big issue, because the temperature differential between, say, Home Depot and your workshop, or even between workshop and your home, okay? So that's a consideration. When you buy that wood, you should bring it in a shop, and ideally it should sit in your shop for 7 days And I mean sit so it's properly supported, either standing on end or laying flat so that it doesn't have a chance to warp. And by the way, if you lay it flat, weigh it down. Okay? Weigh it down so that something will keep it from bowing on you. And if we don't do that, what's going to happen is we're going to start assembling it. And remember I was just talking about the tabletop that was all wavy because of the grain, and they were trying to balance it out by flipping the grain on every other piece? Yeah, that's how things like that happened, is they didn't let the wood acclimate. And then because they didn't let it acclimate, they didn't deal with the cupping. They didn't take that board that's slightly cupped like this one and run it through their planer, flattening it out before assembly. Or they didn't plan in such a way, okay, I'll assemble it and then I'll run it through the planer, whatever it might be. Okay? So it's necessary. Now, ideally, 7 days. If you can't do 7 days, at a minimum, give it 48 hours. Now, if your workshop is climate controlled, and actually I just installed a mini split in my workshop just a couple weeks ago, so I now actually have a climate controlled workshop for the first time in forever. And that makes a huge difference for two reasons. Number one, the temperature of my workshop is close to the temperature of my house, and it's also close to the temperature of Home Depot, okay? That means I'm not dealing with a huge temperature variation. But the other thing that air conditioning does for us is air conditioning dries the air. It removes a lot of moisture from the air. So the humidity level in my workshop is lower, which means that the wood has a better chance of drying out for me. That's a big deal, okay? And that really makes a difference. Now, if you can't afford air conditioning, I understand that, because as I said, this is a new thing for me, and it costs me a pretty penny. Think about getting a dehumidifier. I used to have a dehumidifier that I used, and I got it off of Craigslist and paid not much for it at all, and that at least helped control the humidity in my workshop. But you're better off if you can climate control. Leave it in there 48 hours, let it sit, lay it somewhere where you know it's going to be flat, weigh it down so it stays flat, and then once it's had a chance to acclimate, start your project. The next thing I want to mention is a very common mistake, and that's not checking the moisture level of the wood before you use it. And this requires having a moisture meter. Now, you can buy really nice moisture meters. This is about the cheapest one you can find right here. And I don't remember what I paid for it, but I'll guarantee you it was under $20, okay? Might have even been under 10. And this has got two probes on here, and I can set it up against the whatever piece of wood, and it will tell me the moisture level of this piece of wood is down around 0.7%. That's really, really dry, okay? This piece of pine here, that's pretty low too. So, you know, it's... Now, the better ones don't have sharp needle-like probes here. They've got a flat probe. This needle-like probe can end up putting an indentation into the wood, which is why the other kind is better, okay? A moisture meter is one of those things every new woodworker needs. And I have to confess, I was woodworking for 45 years before I bought one. Why? Because I didn't understand the value of it. By checking the moisture content of your wood, you can make sure that wood is ready to be used before you start cutting it. If you check it and you find out that the moisture content is still too high, you either use some other wood or you wait. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a project that's going to warp, twist, split, come apart in one way or another, and you're going to be extremely upset and very dissatisfied. So, yeah, I know it can be a little frustrating to check that board and say, oh no, I can't use this yet. I can't do the project I was going to do. Yeah, that's frustrating. But I'll guarantee you it's nowhere near as frustrating as putting the project together and then finding out you've got that wavy tabletop. This next one is something I have to confess I have been guilty of many a time, and that's storing your wood directly on the ground. Now, when I say on the ground, I'm also including on a concrete floor. I've got a concrete floor in my workshop like most people do, and yes, there have been times that I've stacked wood up on the concrete floor. Now, you wouldn't think that'd be a problem, but concrete can contain moisture, and actually moisture in the ground can soak up through the concrete, and your wood can get moisture off of the concrete. If you have to stack it on the floor, and I still do at times, especially if I bring a fair amount of wood home, then what I'll do is I'll put some scrap wood down, running crosswise, and I'll stack it on top of that. You know, kind of like that, okay? What that's going to do for me is it's going to protect my wood from absorbing that moisture off the ground. I don't care if that piece of scrap wood gets moisture. I care if the wood I'm going to use gets moisture. So by stacking on top of something, I protect the wood. Now the other part of that is, do you have water leaking into your workshop? I do at times. Through the personnel door and the garage door that I've got here, I get water leaking into my workshop. So all my wood in the workshop is always up off the floor. Again, scrap wood. I put scrap wood down on the floor, I stack it up on it. The wood over here in this rack that's standing on end is all standing on a piece of 2x6. Why? Keep it up out of that water. Maybe the 2x6 will get wet, but it's going to protect the wood that I've got there that I'm intending to use. I have yet to have that wood get wet. So that's an important part of it too. Watch out for that. Now plywood can be problematic too. It still absorbs water, especially the end grain. So, you know, plywood's got the veneers at 90 degrees to each other. So if whatever's sitting on the floor, you're going to have end grain and you're going to have long grain there. Well, so that means it's going to absorb water at a different rate, which is going to eventually tear that wood up. Okay, that's a real problem. Granted, plywood is more dimensionally stable than lumber is. It's better able to withstand that moisture. It's better able to stand temperature changes, humidity changes, all that. But it can still get damaged by it. What's worse than plywood, though, are what they call plywood products or engineered wood products. I'm talking about things like MDF and OSB, okay? They'll absorb water much more quickly than wood or plywood, and they'll be more seriously damaged because essentially it breaks down the adhesive that's holding that together. I recently did an experiment here where I took pieces of different types of plywood sheet goods or engineered woods. I had plywood, I had particle board, I had a piece of maple hardwood as a control, I had OSB, I had MDF, and I put them all in water and I let them sit overnight, about a ½ inch of water. And then the next day I looked at what kind of shape those pieces were in. Well, the plywood was wet, but not seriously damaged. The OSB was wet, and you could literally see where the edge of that board had started fanning out. When you look at a house, especially older homes, and you look at the roof and you see the edges cupping up, that's because they used, they used to call chipboard, which is the predecessor to OSB, and there was no drip edge, the metal drip edge they put on now, and the edge of those boards would absorb water and they'd start to swell. That's exactly what happened to that sample, okay? The worst, though, was the MDF. It had not only absorbed water, but it absorbed water all the way through the length of the piece, and it had swollen up about, if I remember correctly, it was 3/16 of an inch from the water, and the structural integrity was shot. So anytime you've got any of these engineered wood products, you also want to make sure they're off the ground so that water can't get to them. Speaking of wood and wood drying, I think I need to mention here, drying wood too quickly can be very problematic. Now, this is something that really applies more to people that harvest their own wood. You know, they'll cut a tree down and they'll cut it into boards. And I've done that. I do that at times. But it also applies very much to wood turners who will take down a tree and they'll cut it into blanks and then set them aside to dry. Now, wood turning can be done with green wood, and there's some wood turners that will only turn green wood, and that's great. Okay, some of us let it dry, and that can be problematic if the wood dries too quick, because what happens is you get a bunch of cracks, or they call them checks, in the wood. And I've got a whole bunch of wood blanks sitting out in my annex that have cracks in them. Now, for me, that's not really an issue because I just fill those with colored epoxy, and I think that looks cool. But some people would say, oh no, that's horrible, and they hate using epoxy with their wood turning. So it really depends. But let's say you get a slab and you're going to make a live edge table or countertop. One of your concerns has got to be how that was dried. Okay, was it dried too quickly? And the sure sign that it's been dried too quickly is you'll get cracks in the ends. There are some live edge tables that are made overseas. I mean, you're talking some huge, gorgeous, expensive tables, and they're not properly dried. And they count on the finish sealing the wood. And so they sell them here, and they sell them for $3,000 to $5,000. And a year later, the people that bought them are finding out that the ends of their tables are cracking. Why? The wood wasn't dried. Okay? So how do you dry that wood correctly? You need to seal the ends. And there's a bunch of different ways you can do it. You can just take, if you got some old latex paint, put a heavy coat of latex paint on it. You can do it with wax. There are actually products specifically made for that. I'm sorry, I can't tell you names of any of them, but there are products specifically made for sealing the end grain. And that's what you want to do, is seal the end grain. And then you've got to give it about a year for every inch of wood thickness. So if you've got a 2-inch slab, you need to give it 2 years to dry thoroughly before you try and use it, okay? So allowing it to dry too quickly it will normally result in cracks and checks. That's the result you get. All right, so, and if it's too close to the center, if it's too close to the pith, you're going to get cupping as well. But it's actually, that's where you're going to get most of your cracks and checks, is close to the pith, okay? So that's something to consider if you harvest live wood, okay, or whatever wood, you know, a deadfall in the neighborhood or whatever it might be. Watch out for drying it too quickly. Next thing I'd like to mention is where you're storing the wood, and specifically I'm referring to storing it in damp places. I mentioned a few minutes ago that I've just recently installed a mini split here in my workshop, which is, I did it for the air conditioning because I'm in a hot climate and I need to make it so I can work in here without sweat dripping off my forehead. And but I also gain the advantage from that of lowering the humidity here in my workshop, and that's wonderful. However, I've got a lot of wood stored in my, what I call my annex, which is a shed out back, and it is not climate controlled. And so I'm sure there's a higher humidity in there than it is in here, okay? A lot of us are really limited in our storage space for wood, and we end up storing wood in places like sheds. That can be a problem because moisture. Now, what I was talking about just a minute ago with sealing the ends of freshly cut or freshly milled, as in sawmilled, wood also applies to boards we buy from the lumberyard or get shipped in. If the board is already at the moisture content you want, it's going to sit around. Seal the ends. Seal the ends. Just take some paint, some old paint, or as I said, you know, paint, wax, some sort of sealant, and seal the ends of that wood so that it's not going to absorb moisture, because that's the place that'll absorb it the most, is the ends. All right? Watch out for where you're storing it and what the moisture level is. And if there's anything you can do to lower the moisture level, there's various things that you can put into a room or into a shed that can do that. I used to live right on the coast, and the humidity was very, very high. And that was really a challenge, because the high humidity would make it very hard to get wood to dry out. And I had these things that we purchased that we would hang, and they were just moisture absorbent. And they would absorb the moisture and help keep that area where I was storing the wood drier. To be a little more specific, I'd actually enclosed an area with plastic where I had my wood stacked, and I'd hang them there. I wasn't trying to dry the whole shop, just where I was storing the wood. Now, what that meant, though, is that the humidity level inside that area was lower than it was in my shop, and yeah, that can cause problems. Avoid direct sunlight. Now, you'd be surprised how much effect sunlight can have on wood, okay? It'll actually change the color. Now, I've got a piece of Purple Heart sitting here, and Purple Heart actually oxidizes and becomes purple. And so we want it to get that sunlight, all right? But sometimes we get effects we don't want. Like, here's a piece of poplar that I just recently planed because it was twisted and I had to straighten it out. Now, if you look at it, it looks like it's poplar. It's the right color, okay? You can see a little water damage on this end. This piece of wood has been sitting around for quite a while. I don't know when I originally got it, but it's been around a while. But if you look at the edge of this, now this is all freshly machined on the plane. If you look on the edge of this, you can see here it's a whole different color. It's a lot more orange, okay? Why? Sunlight. It oxidized that surface and changed the color of my poplar. That's the color I want. That's the color I had. So anytime you've got a piece of wood that's sitting in sunlight, it's likely to change the color. Just take a look at a cedar fence, a cedar privacy fence in the backyard. What happens to it? The color changes, right? It starts out that nice kind of reddish cedar color, ends up kind of gray. Well, you can actually pressure wash it and get rid of that gray and get back to the cedar color, but that surface is oxidized. That's what happened. So you don't want that to happen with wood you're going to use for projects, because maybe it's going to mess up your project for you. Easy way to protect it, get it in out of the sun. Don't have, or watch out for windows in your shop. If you have windows, make sure the light coming through those windows doesn't fall directly on any of your lumber. Having your wood not properly supported while it's being stored. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago about stickering it, and that is specifically for wood that's laying flat. And I talked about putting those strips of wood under the wood, under your stack of wood, to keep it flat. Now, you should sticker about every 2 feet. That's about the farthest you should go. You can go closer together than that and it won't hurt anything, but 2 feet's a pretty good distance. So if you've got say a 8-foot board, that means you're doing it at 1 foot, 3 foot, 5 foot, and 7 feet. Okay, you're doing it 4 times through that length, and that's between every layer. Now, the other part of that is putting some weight on top of it to keep it down, because especially, you know, the bottom pieces in a stack, they've got the weight of the wood above them that's pressing down on them, but the top pieces don't have much weight. So put some cinder blocks or whatever up there on the top to add some weight to the top to keep the top pieces from bowing on you, okay? So we want to make sure that it's all laid flat. Now, that's if you're storing it flat. If you're storing it on the wall, laying horizontally on a rack on your wall somewhere, you either want full support under it, or you want, like I just mentioned, supports every 2 feet. If you're using like regular angled supports that, you know, shelf supports going to the wall, all right, that's fine. We'll put them every 2 feet, all right? Or, you know, if that may end up meaning you have to put them every 16 inches, or if you have to, every 32 inches, but if you're going to do it every 32 inches, that's every other stud, you flip it every once in a while, flip them over so you keep them from warping. If you've got any sort of shelves, metal shelves in your shop, they'll probably be good and flat and they'll probably support it well. But if you've built wood shelves like I have in my shop, they may not remain flat, so you want to make sure that you check on that. Now, a better way to store your wood is to store it vertically. I've got a rack over here where I've got wood boards stacked vertically, and I've got a few over in that corner of the shop as well. And then I've got partial pieces of plywood and other sheet goods stored over in this corner. In all cases, I try and make them stand up as straight as I possibly can. You don't want wood that's leaning. You put that wood leaning like that, and the weight of the wood, especially if there's a bunch of pieces stacked up, okay, you get down to this last piece here, it's supporting all that weight of all those pieces, it will eventually bow. So you don't want that. And that's true of lumber, and it's also true of sheet goods. If you've got to support it vertically, and I do recommend supporting it vertically, support it as vertically as possible. My rack over here on the wall that I just mentioned a moment ago, I always keep that rack full, even if I've got to put scrap pieces in there to make sure everything is standing vertically. If it's not standing vertically, I either go buy some lumber to put in there. I find, as I said, some scrap to put in there. I do something so that the pieces remain vertical at all times. I do have a little bit of lumber in my shop that's on like shelf supports, and it's horizontal, and the supports are about 4 feet apart, and about once a month I go through and flip all that wood, okay? Because I'm trying to keep from getting a bow in it. So proper support is really, really important to protect that wood, because you can get the best wood in, and because you haven't stored it properly, you end up with warped wood. Now, this is something I would have to say be especially careful of with hardwoods that you have shipped in, all right, from a hardwood supplier that come through the mail or whatever shipping service you use, because you're going to have a different humidity level in your shop than they do in their warehouse, and you don't know what condition that wood is in when it gets there. So there's a real strong chance of it warping as it dries in your shop if it is not laid flat and properly supported or stored vertically. Finally, the last thing I'd like to mention, that's something that can ruin your wood before you get to work on it, is chemical damage. Now, most of us, our workshops are more than just a woodworking shop. This workshop of mine is basically for woodworking, but I used to be an engineer and I build some things that aren't made of wood. I also work on my cars out of this shop. I'm not bringing the cars in here, there's no room, but with tools in here and working them outside, and I've got antifreeze and oil and other chemicals. I've got chemicals for maintaining my yard. You know, I try and keep as much of that out of the workshop and in what I call my annex as I can, but some of it's in here. And there's always a risk of chemical spills, or for that matter, even the chemicals we use in woodworking, such as paint thinners, and other things like that, there are risks of spills getting on the wood. There's a lot of ways that chemical spills can damage wood. Of course, the most obvious is they can discolor it, okay? The second thing that can happen is that they can seal the pores. If you have something oily get on your wood, it's going to fill those pores, and then it may take years before it dries out to the point where those pores are the same, are as open as the rest of the wood, so that if you try and stain it, it comes out even. It may never get to that point. So chemicals can be a serious, serious problem in your workshop. Try and keep your chemicals, ideally you should have them in a chemical storage cabinet. I don't have a chemical storage cabinet, and one of these days hopefully I will. But that's the ideal, keeping them in a chemical storage cabinet where they are, where even if it does spill, it spills inside the cabinet, okay? Now the other part of this, and this is a chemical thing too, is overspray. Now I've moved my finishing operations to my shed, to my annex, and part of the reason I set that up as an annex is because there's always so much sawdust in here. Trying to finish things in here is a joke. And so I don't do any sawdust operations out there, and I don't do any finishing operations in here. And that's the way I've worked it out. It's not as convenient as being able to do the finishing here in my workshop, but I get a better result, okay? Overspray though, now some guys will have a spray booth in their workshop, and that's great. I don't really spray my finishes, I brush my finishes, but if you spray your finishes, watch out for overspray, because you can get these little fine particulate spray that you can't even see, and it'll travel all the way across your shop and land on the lumber in your lumber rack, and you've just sealed the pores in that wood. And then when you want to use that wood and you go to, you build something out of it and you think it's great, and you go to finish it and you got all these little spots. And what in the world happened? You already sealed the wood. That's chemical damage, okay? Is it common? Actually, it's more common than you would believe. Now, you can solve that problem by sanding, but if you don't even notice that it's there, you're not going to sand it off, right? You might get it in your normal sanding process, but then again, you might not. So these are the things that I have found that can ruin our wood before we even start working. Now, as I said, I've made a lot of scrap working the wood, but what I really hate is the wood that gets ruined before I even get to use it. So proper care, proper treatment of the wood, proper storage of the wood makes a huge difference in making sure that I don't end up so frustrated when I get done with my projects. So there we've got it. 10 different mistakes that we make with our wood before we even start working on it. I think I probably made every single one of these at least once, more like probably at least 10 times, but that's through 50 years. So the thing is, we want to avoid them. And I'm hoping that by my sharing my mistakes with you, I can help you avoid making those same mistakes. And maybe that'll help keep the cost of our woodworking down just a little bit, and keep our spouses from getting upset about spending too much money on wood. You know what I mean? So go take good care of your wood, and let's make some sawdust, huh?